to 10 minutes and then open it up for some discussion and see where we go. How does that sound?
Everybody should maybe take a moment and just mention their name for the purpose of the recording so that later on you could tell it was Bob and not me or something like that. But I'll begin to open it. This is January 20, 2021. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a really interesting men's study at Woods on Saturday. And we had a lively discussion about how the society communicates with each other, especially with mixed political viewpoints and passions, and what the techniques might have been that were offered to people in Jesus' day, or at least Matthew's day, who wrote this Gospel of Matthew, when he's trying to encourage people how to do an effective job talking with each other. And so I think it's really interesting that we're experimenting with the first day on Inauguration Day, right? It's very timely in that sense. The only thing that's difficult, we have a bunch of shy guys in this class who don't have very strong opinions, but we will try to do our best to encourage people to speak up. So to start, before we get going, I just thought everybody at least go around the room and mention who their name is, so that if we listen to this or someone else listens later, they can sort of figure out who all's here. So maybe Vic, being the youngest guy in the room, you may want to start first, and then we'll go around from there.
Okay, Victor Marone.
And where are you sitting at today for this meeting?
I'm sitting at my home in my den
In Moscow, Russia, or
in good old Annapolis, Maryland.
Great. Okay. Bob, we see you next on the video. Go ahead.
Okay, it's Bob Bauman, and I am ensconced in my office, and that's in beautiful downtown Severna Park, Maryland.
So we've got David on the video. We'll let him go next, and then we'll get to Mark and Bert.
David Nelson in Arnold, Maryland.
And okay, Mark.
Mark Brignoli. I'm sitting in my home office in Severna Park, Maryland.
And last but not least, our host.
Elvis.
Bert, are you there?
And this is Bert Jackson coming to you from Roxborough, North Carolina. Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Did you get that?
Got it.
Rockville, North Carolina.
Roxborough.
So go ahead. I've Roxborough, North Carolina. Bert Jackson.
Roxborough.
Very good. This also acts as a sound check for us. So in the material that we sent you ahead of time, we're looking at this question of how to engage people and persuade people. We're going to look at these passages in Matthew, and what the idea is that we'll have like a 5-minute overview and then some time for interaction. The overview sometimes might have more just me speaking, or sometimes you all just reading something just to sort of get going. First of all, one question: you all have received a PDF copy of this resource book, right? How many of you have actually picked up a copy in hard copy so far? David?
I have.
Okay.
Mark has.
Okay, good. Bert, have you haven't yet, Bert, right? Because you're far away. So if everybody has either a Bible or the resource book, because the resource book, the purpose of that is not to just have something somebody would sit down on a weekend and read casually like a novel, but have a bunch of things between two covers that will give you some material. And as we talked about before, we're going to try to at least cover, by looking at this material, the background, just the audience in particular, who the audience was for this material. And to do that, I thought maybe some people who have good audio, so probably not Bert because his audio isn't great, but he's welcome to chime in. But maybe somebody could read a few of these verses in Matthew 4 to get started, and in another spot in Matthew, just so we could continue to do the sound check and actually hear what the material is that I would point your attention to in terms of the audience. So one of the purposes of the resource book in our discussion is to find out, when we're looking at this material, what's actually there and what's it saying, and what's your thought about it as you read it and discuss it with us. And it might be very different from what you used to think before. You can change your mind and you can disagree with anybody in the group, but the idea is usually we'll try to say why we disagree or what our concerns or questions are. And so to get started, I would be interested in say somebody maybe volunteering to read a couple sections, starting at Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. And as you're finding that, who would want to do that one? And someone else, if somebody else could look at Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, which is the end of Matthew. And there'll be a reason to mention why we're reading that. But since we're focusing on Matthew 5 through 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' major teaching in Matthew, and we're going to talk about it, one of the things you get to do is some fair cheating. In other words, when we're talking about Matthew 5 through 7, it's okay if you peek a little ahead and to see what's going on. So you're not put it in an unfair advantage. Somebody saying, tell me what you know about 5 through 7, when you got maybe some clues that could be right in front of it. So who has a Bible handy and can read at least this section on Matthew 4, verses 18 to 20?
Verses 18 to 20, where I have a Bible handy. I mean, Jesus calls the first disciples. Is that what you're referring to?
Absolutely.
I had a Bible handy.
That's okay. Now, by the way, in the resource book, towards the first, after the first third of the book, there is one version of these texts in English. It's just a different version that you might be used to.
Okay.
I went at random, and then you don't have to read from the Greek because.
So, what you want verses what 18 to
20.
Okay, 18 to 20. Now I will tell everyone that I am reading from the New Revised Standard Version, fully revised, updated, the Harper's Collins Study Bible, just for reference.
Great. I thank you for that. That helps a lot.
Yeah, and so Jesus calls the first disciples. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. I think I've gone beyond what you told me to read.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No, that's okay. So it's actually a better ending point because you see the sets of brothers. Okay. Now, someone else or you, doesn't matter, who has Matthew 28. This is the very end of the book, verses 16 to 20.
Matthew 28?
Yep. That's the very tail end.
Yeah. I've been going back and forth in this thing as well. Because this Bible particularly. Yes, and what verses are you referring to?
The last 4 or 5, from 16 on to the end.
The commissioning of the disciples. Verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Okay, so the first question that I'd ask you that you can tell me, and then I'll give you some background material how it compares elsewhere. In those 2 sections, obviously you have Jesus, and he's talking to disciples, but what's going on in chapter 4 about the whole topic of disciples? What do you hear about the person disciple, which means like a student or whatever? What's going on in 4 about disciples, and what's Jesus challenging them to go do? In
To
that
go make
chapter.
disciples, to go gather other disciples.
And how do you get that notion? I think it's sort of obvious, but I think you're right. He's gathering. What words is he using in that Matthew 4 to say that?
Well, he says follow, fish for people, fish for men. And he also says, to follow him.
Okay.
And I might add for me, I think, your book is great in the sense that, I would have never thought to think, I like to put the Bible in context, but to dig deep about who's really there, and this type of thing makes a big difference.
Yes. Now we're going to read a little bit more in that section of 4, but just to get a sense of how important this is for Matthew, what do you think? How do you think there's this tie, and do you think it may be important as to what's going on at the very end of Matthew when they're finishing the book? What's the punchline of Matthew according to those last 4 verses or so that you read, 4 or 5 verses in Matthew 28?
Well, he's challenged the disciples to go out and carry the word forward, preach the word.
And what are they going to do if they do that? What's going to happen? Relative to disciples, so that let's focus on that word disciple for a moment. The disciples are there, and what's Jesus asking them to do?
Well, he's asking them, it seems to me, to obey what he has commanded them to do, and to take that knowledge, so to speak, and use it to fish for people.
Yes, make disciples, right?
Make disciples, yeah.
To teach them.
Yeah.
Baptize them and teach them. Yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of like you make disciples and you teach them, and then you baptize them, right? So what's really interesting is at the very beginning, when you start getting introduced to Jesus and his role with the disciples in 4, all the way at the end of the book, he's concluding. So therefore, in 4, he says, I'm going to teach you how to go make disciples, right? I'm going to show you how to fish and recruit, right? They're professional fishermen, so they know all about catching, right? So he's saying, hey, you want to learn how to catch people? Well, that's basically how to recruit people, right? And persuade them. And at the very end, doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
One thing I just, for fun of it, I'll throw this in, even though we're not ending at the last verse, and we're not putting a lot of time there. When it says the disciples came together and worshiped Jesus, and then it says some doubted. What's going on there? Do you have any idea what that means? You go back at the end.
Well, maybe they had doubt, not so much in Jesus, but in themselves and being able to carry out the mission in
That's-
oneself.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah. Go ahead.
that's just one interpretation for me.
Anybody else have any other thoughts about that?
Well, I think the only other one left is that they're doubting
Thomas.
their leader, Jesus. Or despite all that's happened, they still are having some doubts. Is this really the guy? And
So you're right. Those are two options. And so when we read through this material, you're going to see, like when we get to the audience part in a moment, any one sentence that's used might have two or three totally legitimate interpretations. So when we talk as a group or we're talking to other people, somebody might come off with something that may make no sense to us because they're thinking of it in a different way. And they, in fact, might be perfectly reasonable, just like those two ways. Now, the way to resolve some of these things is to put them together. So like when it says Jesus, when they saw him back in verse 17, what was their response in verse 17 when they saw Jesus? And Matthew 28, way at the end. So because
they worship him.
they worshiped him. Okay. So how would that reaction add support to either Mark's idea or the alternative that Vic mentioned? If they're worshiping him, do they have doubt about who he is? Because if they and I may be giving too much away here, but if they didn't know who he was, they weren't going to worship him, right?
Right.
So that sort of gives evidence that Mark's opinion that he is actually supported by that sentence.
Yes.
Okay. So then going back to that, if you actually looked up the Greek word, which I'm not expecting you to do it, there's many times there's more than one word that is used for a certain thing. And so one of the ways of using that word is, and you'll see some of the English translations, instead of saying some doubted, they'll say some wavered. And the idea of wavering would be, yeah, we buy into who this guy is. It's really Jesus. We're really impressed. We're in awe. We're worshiping him. He's the one, right? No doubt about it. Everyone believed it. They didn't have to poke fingers in him to figure out who he was. But they wavered. And why were they wavering? Well, he's been doing this whole mission about, well, I'm going to teach you how to fish for people, and you're going to be servants of other people in doing it. You may lay down your life doing it because you're going to follow my example. And then the guys can say, if I got to follow your example about how to bring other people in, are you suggesting I might get killed doing it? Or certainly not be really successful financially or whatever? How is this sustainable? And so whatever Jesus' method of teaching and persuading is, that we're going to go back and study, at the very end, he's actually being asked by his disciples who are wondering, is this disciple thing going to work? Because your methodology looks like it had some bad consequences here. You got crucified. So Jesus answered them saying, well, if you have any doubt about my method, he tells them about what likelihood his method is going to work at the end of chapter 28. And what are the words he uses to convince them that his method is absolutely certain to work?
Yeah, well, the other thing, Chuck, that comes to mind is maybe they knew, didn't they know something about the people that Jesus is talking about to go and fish for?
Yeah.
And maybe they had doubt about convincing or teaching those people because of who they were. They were correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't they the lowest? They were on the low echelon of society, so to speak, in that time frame. economically and maybe with literacy and so on and so forth.
That's a very good point. So you're suggesting that he's not only, the disciples may have wavered, not only because they might think, hey, this is a tough way to live or a tough way to go about this stuff. They also may have doubt about, and how well will they receive what we're saying? I'm willing to put my life on the line, but if they don't listen, then it's not going to do anybody any good, right?
Yeah.
Or if I don't convince them, right?
Yeah.
So what's the, so given both of those, I think both of those are good. Maybe there's a third one. Is there a third one anybody might throw on the table? We can come back to it later, but so then the point is, what does Jesus say about his certainty, and why is Jesus certain about the outcome? In the last couple of verses of Matthew.
Because he has all the authority on heaven and earth.
Yeah. And how long will this last, and what good will it do you?
Well, he tells them that he will be with them till the end of the age.
The end of the age, end of the world.
End of the world. Yeah.
And in what places? Just a few places?
Everywhere.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty daunting thing. So this is telling us a little bit about the audience here. Well, let me ask you a question. What is that telling us also about the audience at this verse? And then we're going to go back and see a little bit more at the beginning. What can you tell me about what Matthew is telling us about the audience, whether you believe him or not? If you just give them, if you just straight up trying to determine what the author is trying to get across, this guy Matthew, what is he telling us about the audience just in those couple of sentences? Who can you think that, maybe we'll put David on the spot. He's one of the guys who's a little shy here. What kinds of things, and there might be 3, 4 different things, but is there anything at all you can decide or infer, deduce, is the audience? What can you tell us about the audience from just those 2 verses?
Not sure.
Well, he said to go teach all nations. And he didn't discriminate between men or women or Gentiles or Jews or Romans or Greeks. It was all mankind, basically,
Okay.
right?
All right, so part of the audience in this group are the disciples hearing Jesus. Well, Jesus is talking to the disciples, so part of the audience is them, but then they're supposed to go out and talk to other people.
Yeah.
All those other people.
Teach all other nations, yeah.
So that's an extended audience.
Yeah.
So it's interesting is you have the audience right in front of, you have Matthew talking about Jesus. Jesus is talking to the disciples, and the disciples are his immediate audience. And then there's the remote audience. And if that holds true, what does that say about us?
We are part of the extended audience.
Exactly. Bingo. He gets an A. See, you guys don't get the A because no, I'm joking. You all get the A. Exactly. So Matthew, the writer, what's his intended audience?
Anyone will read it.
Yeah, and he's got a high ambition about his audience, doesn't he? So let's go back then and do a little bit more audience check back in Matthew 4. And let's go back to, let's go all the way back to chapter 4, verse 12. And let's go and read, we're going to learn a little bit about Jesus, and we're going to try to learn a little bit more about the audience, and we're going to just fly over this pretty quickly. So somebody read verse 12 through what we read before, 12 through, I think it's
17.
17, yeah. Just read that section. Just somebody read it quickly out loud for the benefit of people who are listening to this another time. And plus it gives the rest of us a chance to think a little bit. The idea is what we're going to try to figure out is what else can we learn about the audience from that section.
I'll be happy to read it, but I have a very old King James thee and thou and thus version.
That's
It's
fine.
my
That's fine. It's
language.
only 1700s English and not Old English or Middle English from 1300.
Right, or archaic English or something. Then the devil leaveth him, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. Now when Jesus has heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the seacoast in the borders of Zabulon and Nephthalim,
Naphtali.
Nephthalim, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Nephthalim, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. From that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
Okay, so real quickly, just throw out comments about what do we know about the audience so far? There, in those verses only.
Well, that area was a poor area, very poor area. Agrarian society. Galilee, I'm mainly referring to, and I assume the other immediate areas.
Okay. And what's that tie to the prophecy?
Sorry,
What was the
Chuck.
question, Chuck?
Yeah.
How does that tie to the prophecy that you just read, Bob? He said that there are poor people all around Galilee, and how does that tie to the prophecy?
Well, one thing he's talking about are Gentiles here.
Yeah, it's a land of the Gentiles.
The
Yeah,
land of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Not of the Jews. And then he's saying that the people which sat in darkness saw great light.
yeah, they're in darkness, and what else? Darkness and what else?
In the shadow of death,
Yeah.
light is sprung up.
So anybody have any connection about what's the significance of the darkness and death? And does that give any support to what Mark was saying a moment ago about poor people?
Well, did the Gentiles have pretty much pagan religions at that point, or?
Well, we can get more into that later, but the idea is that there's a mixed group. It's not a stronghold of hardcore Judaism like maybe in Jerusalem. So some of that going on.
Right.
And we're going to read a few more verses, and they're going to talk about some of the other areas too. But the part I was focusing on was the idea of the land and of the shadow of death. Some say the valley of the shadow of death, or the land of darkness and the region of death. What kind of neighborhood is that? What kind of locality? What do you know about the area? What are you learning about that area by him saying that?
Pretty
Very poor and
depressed area.
destitute.
Yeah,
Yeah, Vic
Yeah,
was saying it.
somebody
Vic, say it again.
Didn't show any
somebody said it,
future.
yeah.
Vic, you had something you were saying?
I said it's a pretty depressed area.
Yeah, that's right. So my thought is that if you go through the valley of the shadow of death, like in the Psalms, right? You don't want to be there any longer than you have to. If you're lucky, God's going to be with you, right? And get you through it. These people seem to be stuck there. They're living there, depending on the English version. They're living there, they're dwelling there, they're sitting there, implying they can't get out. They're sort of trapped in really bad circumstances. They're sort of like the most hopeless people. And so it looks sort of dismal for them. So
The inner cities.
pardon me?
The inner cities.
Yeah, except they're the outer region, you know, and the cities of that region, which is sort of destitute.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the reputation, just like we have a reputation in our country for living in the inner city. That means something to us, right? Maybe in ghetto neighborhoods or something like that. They had a reputation that this was the worst of the worst. And the idea of the prophecy is that the people who are in the darkest circumstances would be the first to see the light. You see how that works? So that tells you about the audience, and it backs up what Mark was saying. Okay, so now, then we already read the part about the calling of the disciples. And then as soon as we finish hearing about the disciples that Mark already read earlier, can somebody read the section that is after that? And that's the last few verses after they followed him. It's about verse 23 or 25. What's that verse number you've got there? 23.
Yeah, that's what 23.
Okay. Why don't
Starts with 23.
why don't you read that? Because now we're going to see what happens. So they tell us, so the first thing they tell us is they're going to the most desperate people who are trapped in the valley of the shadow of death, or the land of death. They can't get out. It's really bad circumstances. Jesus is asking the disciples, hey, you want to learn how to fish for people? And they say, yeah, okay, come follow me. Then the next thing we hear is what comes in that next verse. It goes for a few verses. Why don't you, whoever has it, read that.
Okay. Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan.
Okay.
Great crowds
Yes.
followed him.
So this is going to give us more information about the audience. So now we're getting into, we already heard about the disciples, we heard about Jesus, now we're hearing about the crowds, right? So it's basically saying, as soon as he tells guys, you want to learn how to fish for people, and they follow him, the next thing you know, they're going all over the place, right? In that area, right? And they tell you some of the places. And it's around Galilee, but what other places did they talk about where they're coming from? Places we don't even know much about. Words. What are some of the words?
Decapolis. I pronounced it Decapolis. It sounds Greek to me, but I don't.
It is Greek to you, and it's Greek to the Greeks because it's a Greek word.
Okay, so I've never heard of that place. I've heard of Jerusalem and Judea, and of course, Jordan. But
Okay.
I haven't heard of that place.
Okay. Does anybody have a hunch what the Decapolis is?
It must be a region somewhere.
Okay.
My guess.
Okay.
Well, they mentioned Syria. He mentions throughout all Syria. I mean, Syria we know of today.
And there's a region up there north of Jerusalem, and that's why you could have a map, and you could sort of look at your Bible map and sort of see where these places are. And so Syria is this general region. So Matthew's writing this book. Matthew's claiming that the people in Jesus' day knew about these areas, obviously, and probably Matthew's still familiar with them as well. Decapolis, one of the benefits of having the resource book is if you get curious, you can look in the resource book in the introduction where we go through some of the background, and we describe in the resource book a little bit of information about these places.
Yeah.
And then some places, if you got really curious, you could go read more. And then, of course, you could always go to Google and do your own search. And one of the benefits of doing a research class like this is you guys can come up with things that I may have missed. And so when we get together in one of these classes, you can do your own homework and say, hey, get a load of what I learned about Syria, or get a load of what I learned about Herod, or get a load of what I learned about Decapolis, right?
Yeah. Decapolis is on the west side of the Jordan River. And for one thing, it's on the other side of the river, while some of these other places, and most of the other places, are on the other side of the river. Not that that is meaningful in any way, but geographically. So they had to cross the river, right?
Yeah. So what happens, by the way, in Latin and English, when you hear the letters dec, what does dec usually mean? Like a decade or?
10 cities.
It's a, yep.
It's 10.
It's
10
10.
cities that were supposedly east and southeast of the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
Along the Jordan.
And so, and when they say cities, you read some stuff, they say, well, they don't mean big cities. They just mean maybe towns or something like that. And so it could be like a region of a bunch of towns, like maybe 10, and so they'll go back and say, yeah, it looks like there's about 10, but so the other purpose of that, and they talked about Gentiles, why did they use the word Decapolis? Does anybody have any guess why they called it that, other than the fact that there might have been 10?
I think it just describes the region rather than any specific village within it.
Yeah. The other part, and you can look at this later without getting into too much detail, is that these were a Greek stronghold. When
that's
the Great came through.
Right.
Okay, and so this whole region, including Egypt, had a lot of Greek influence. And Matthew, by the way, is written in Greek. So, and he's writing this to Jewish people who had a lot of Greek influence. Okay, so now that we can always get into more detail later. Now we're going to go into probably a couple of the most important verses related to this by reading chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Someone read that for me.
okay. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, and that's when he begins the Beatitudes. Do you?
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't have to go into Beatitudes yet. That's going to be the section. So the first, and we're in a moment, I need somebody to go to the last couple of verses of chapter 7. But before we go there, you can point out, the question is, Jesus sees the crowd, right? And then what did he do after he sees the crowd?
He starts to climb the mountain, go up a mountain, And
Yeah, and then he
calls
sat
his
down,
disciples.
and then what did the disciples do?
They came to him. They followed him, I assume.
And then he began to teach whom?
Well, I think he began to teach the crowd, the people that followed, in addition to the disciples.
Okay. Now, do you have any other opinions? Did Jesus just, so where are the crowds and where are the disciples? Obviously, the disciples are there, but are the crowds still there or not?
The crowds were there.
Yeah,
I
me
think
too.
the crowds are there, and Jesus was saying, hey guys, this is how it's done. I think he wasn't speaking to the disciples, but to show them how to preach to the crowds.
But so if Jesus, but why is Jesus going up to the mountain?
Because
I
there's
think,
a large number of people, and I
yeah,
think
just
he wanted to have
not to
his
be lost
voice.
on the fact that he's struggling to get to higher ground, so he can, so his voice will carry over the crowd.
Project to the crowd, right?
Okay, so that's a good reason to why he goes up the mountain. Either so he goes up the mountain so he could be at the bottom talking up to them, or at the top talking down to them. One way or the other, he's using the height as an advantage, right?
Yes.
Now,
Right.
some people, a fair number of people over the centuries had come up with another interpretation totally different from that. Could you imagine what it might be?
That he took his disciples up into the mountain to give them a teaching lesson. So away from the crowd.
Away from the crowds, exactly. And that's where, so the idea is some people will say, and we'll have to ask her questions like, why do they say this? But some people will say Jesus wanted to run away from the crowds. And he wanted to just talk with the disciples because he had just disciple stuff to say. He didn't want the other guys to get in the way. And he only wanted to talk to the crowds. And so because he talks about the crowds came and then the disciples, some people will say, see the sequencing there? The sequencing supports my, not Chuck's, but their idea that the crowds were never the people he intended to talk to. Now, if somebody can go to the end of chapter 7 and read the last couple of verses of chapter 7 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount.
And as it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes.
Okay, and what did they say when who were amazed?
The crowds.
The people.
Yeah, the people
The
are
crowds.
the crowds, right? Not just the disciples. Now, read verse 1 of chapter 8.
When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, there came a leper.
Again, that's far enough. Mark, what does your version say?
Mine says, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and
Okay.
there was a leper.
Okay, that's fine. So in
who
this,
came- Oh, sorry.
that's far enough. So in the one I have too, it says from the mountainside.
Mhm.
Going back to that idea that he didn't have to climb to the tip top of the mountain.
Right.
The mountainside for elevation. So the question so if we're using these couple of verses to help decide, did Jesus run away from the crowds or not? What do these verses at the end of the Sermon on the Mount indicate? Does it give evidence to the fact that he abandoned the crowds, or does it give evidence that the crowds were there the whole time?
No, the crowds were there the whole time.
Crowds had to be there the whole time because they were astonished at what he said.
Okay. So even though somebody might make a grammatical argument that sentence at the beginning of chapter 5 could possibly be interpreted either way, and instead of sitting there and arguing with the person, which way is better? If you go to 7, you get the end of 7, you get indication that yes, in fact, the crowds were there. Now, if they're stubborn and they say, no, he ran away from the crowds, but there are a whole bunch of new crowds who magically show up out of nowhere, what would you say to that argument? He didn't do a very good job running away from the crowds now, did he? Right?
Right.
And then other people will say, well, Jesus was talking. So if you have to admit these huge crowds are there at the beginning, and they're spellbound, and they're there all the way to the end, and they come, and the crowds follow him down from the mountainside. So he hasn't lost anybody. Half of them didn't go home out of boredom, right? Some people will say, okay, I admit the crowds were there, but he never really was talking to them at all. Nothing he said applied to the crowds. He was only talking to the people who sat at his feet, but they merely overheard. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, the new crowds overheard, or maybe all the crowds were there the whole time overheard. And they were amazed because they caught pieces of this stuff and they overheard, but it obviously wasn't intended for them. What would you say about that?
No, I would say that, Jesus, as we read previously, ministered to the crowd. He had people who saw him healing the sick and, et cetera, et cetera. And so the crowds, he began to develop a crowd from his ministry.
That's right, Mark.
And so the crowds followed.
And what was he announcing? When it says preaching, it means announcing. What was he announcing according to 4 to the crowds? At the end of 4, when he says, what was he doing with the crowds? He was healing them, and what else was he doing?
Well, he was teaching. He was proclaiming the good news.
Yes, he was proclaiming
The kingdom is coming. The kingdom,
Yeah.
right.
So that he's talking,
Yes.
right? So he's
Yeah,
talking. So first of all, he tells the fishermen, "Hey, you want to learn how to fish for people?" He's saying to them, "I'm going to help you persuade people," right? And then he's going around talking to all the people, and then at the end, there's people there, amazed by what he's talking. Now, if he wasn't talking to the people, and he was only talking to the handful of people in front of him, and he didn't want the other people to hear, and he was talking in a low voice, then they wouldn't have heard him. Or if, on the other hand, you have maybe hundreds or thousands of people standing around, and the disciples in the front row, and he's talking gibberish to everybody except for the disciples, talking to the disciples only about things only the disciples cared about. And it was obvious that these people were, according to some people, that they were overhearing Jesus. Wouldn't it be a little odd that if I just wanted to talk to a few guys, it's as if we went to Gary's Grill after the men's study, and instead of just talking to you guys, I raised my voice so the entire restaurant could hear me over the clanging of the dishes and everybody else? People would think this guy's a little weird. They'd be telling us, "Hey, calm down, shut up, don't talk so loud. We can't hear ourselves at the other end of the restaurant," right? They think I'm crazy. So all of these things would say that Jesus is not merely talking to the disciples with a message that does not apply to the crowds, and that the crowds, in fact, were the intended recipients. They were the primary audience, because Jesus was supposedly preaching the good news to them, with the disciples listening in, getting on-the-job training lessons on how to make disciples. Isn't that interesting?
Well, Chuck, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
They mention in chapter 4, they just talk about the multitudes. They don't talk about the disciples. In the beginning of chapter 5, they talk about the multitudes. They don't talk about him talking to the disciples. Where do these biblical scholars come up with this attitude or this opinion that the May was wanting to talk to his inner circle, but not to everybody, when it seems like the text is pretty obviously to the contrary?
Okay, so one of the problems, I have to admit, by having us jump around a little bit to sort of see the front and the back and then go back to the front again. So you remember the text says that Jesus first starts talking to the, well, first of all, you hear that the great light has to appear to the most desperate of people. Then you hear Jesus talking to the disciples. "Hey, do you want to catch people?" Okay. So he is talking to the disciples in 4 when he says, "I'm going to teach you how to go catch people." And then right after that, he says, so the disciples are following him when he's going all around the place talking to the crowds. And then by the time you get to the first verse of 5, you're basically saying the crowds are following Jesus, and Jesus sees the crowds, and the implication is the disciples haven't left him yet. And so Jesus go up to the mountainside so he can get his position to speak to the crowds, because that's what he's doing. But he wants the disciples to get a front row seat, which disciples usually do. They sit at the feet of their teacher, and they get the front row seat watching Jesus in action. So you definitely have the disciples and Jesus and the crowds, but you got them all. And so what the scholars are doing is they have a reason for ignoring what appears to be obvious. Because what are the teachings Jesus is going to start to talk about? And if you go into your own library and pull out a book on Matthew, go to the church library, pull out a commentary on Matthew, go to Google, go pull, look at something online free from, because a lot of stuff is free. Go and buy some. Or you could look at the ones I quote in my book. You could read quotes out of my resource book for you to make it easy for you. What you're going to see is that I think there's a good reason why people have historically wanted to ignore the obvious, that Jesus was talking to the crowds. And I'm going to tell you what I think the reasons are, and you have to decide for yourself whether or not you think that's pertinent. Number one, when Jesus is announcing the good news, to the people who are desperate, and it's a surprise good news, because the message normally is, if you are suffering terribly, obviously you don't have important friends to come help you. You don't have enough money to extricate yourself out of this. And obviously God doesn't even care about you, because God is very powerful. And if he cared anything about you, he wouldn't leave you in this mess. So you not only don't matter to us, you don't matter to God. You see, that's how people normally, the attitude they're to have. And Jesus surprises everyone. This announcement is a surprise announcement, and it's a good news announcement, because he's going to the people who have nothing but bad news, saying, I got a surprise for you guys. What's that? There's good news. Oh yeah, we'd like to hear some. Well, the good news is that God is working through your bad news. The very fact that you're at the bottom means God's doing something special, because he says the people at the bottom who are crushed in spirit, like an atheist in a foxhole. You could be an atheist because you got all these opportunities to be intellectual and academic, but when you're in a foxhole, very often you may have a change of heart. And these people were all in a foxhole. And Jesus goes to these people who are living in a foxhole, saying the surprise is God's good news is that he's working through your bad news, and you're not only better than you think you are the co-owners of the kingdom of heaven. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. The entire multiverse, all the galaxies of the universe, and even where the angels hang out in different dimensions, all emerge from the kingdom of heaven. And you are the co-owners of that. It's like absolutely bizarre news. The people on the bottom are on top, and the emperors of the world are way below them. Now, and then you hear all these other blessings. He gives a whole bunch of them, and we're going to talk about that next time. But people start seeing blessings, and he's talking to all kinds of people. People will say, well, if Jesus is talking about blessings and not curses, and how fortunate they are, he must be talking to people like me, a psychological bias. He must be talking to people like me, like the disciples. The disciples are the obvious blessed people, not those riffraff, poor people despised by most at the bottom of the rungs of the ladders, who are stuck, trapped. They can't get their way out of their situation. They're the ones living in foxholes. Most people don't stay in a foxhole any longer than you need to. And they don't stay in the valley of the shadow of death. So obviously, in some minds, the blessings don't belong to those people. They only belong to the disciples. And then he says, at the end of the Beatitudes, which we'll talk about later, he says to these, whoever's sitting there, you are salt and light, right? You are salt of the earth, right? Remember right after the Beatitudes, you see that after the Beatitudes section in 5?
Yeah.
How many times have you heard preachers say, you who are believers and are followers of Jesus, just like disciples, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. What gives you the right to think that those no good scumbag riffraff poor people who aren't following Jesus yet, they haven't even made a turn to Jesus yet, he's just preaching to them, hoping he might find a few disciples if some of them turn and from their miserable ways and join him. How would he tell that audience that they're the salt and the light? That's only for good, nice people like me and the disciples, not the riffraff. But Jesus is telling the audience that they are all salt and light. How does that work? And if that's not bad enough, you keep going through all of chapter 5, and he does a bunch of more stuff that we'll talk about another day. And you ultimately get to the punchline of it all, where he says, love your enemies and pray for the worst case. And then he gives them the Lord's Prayer, our Father. That can't be for the crowd. The crowds aren't children of the Father, only the disciples. How do you know that? Well, I don't know for sure because I don't want to look at the text and do any homework to figure out what the text says. But my general theology and everything else I studied about the Bible teaches me that you only get to be a child of God once you're born again. And it's true. We all agree that you have to be born again to be really connected with the Father. So whenever they use the Father, the only possible way the word Father could be used, or child of the Father could be used, is if you are a disciple and born again. This is all imposed from the outside. These are assumptions from the outside. And there is basic almost anger at anybody who would suggest that the people who are not really following Jesus, may be opposed to Jesus, certainly not his disciples, even have the right to pray. In fact, there are preachers who would say this, and there are commentaries who would pray. So when you pick up a commentary, and I give you a gentleman's bet, $100 bet for all of you guys, fine, I'll give you a standing bet of $500. I don't know if I'm going to get the money. Bob will have to loan it to me. $500 bet. Find 5 commentaries that look at the blessings and the salt and light declarations and the prayer, Lord's Prayer, and tell me anybody who has talked about that. But since there might be somebody, I'm hoping there's somebody. So that's why I said 5. The bet's for 5. So you got to look at a whole bunch of places to find 5 where the prayer is for the crowds, where the salt and light declaration is for the crowds. Even so, when you go back, and I'll make this as a final statement, we'll talk about it a bit more. But this is sort of like getting to a wrap up here. When you look at all these people talking about who the audience is, and you're going to hear them say, eventually, in modern scholars, they all admit that the crowds were the audience along with the disciples, because you just can't escape that the crowds are there. Just you get to 7, the crowds are there. They're paying attention. They're understanding. And even though some say they're overheard, other modern scholars say, no. They weren't overhearing. They really were paying attention. They weren't just overhearing. Jesus was intending to talk to them. That's why they were spellbound. Even those people who are now in the minority, but they're maybe the new majority emerging out of scholarship, saying the crowds really are there. The stuff is for the crowds. Those same very people, when they start talking about the blessings and the declaration that you're salt and light and the prayer, they just go into autopilot and start talking about the disciples all over again, even though they themselves have said the crowds are there, but this doesn't apply to them. Well, if this doesn't apply to the crowds, and that doesn't apply to the crowds, and that doesn't apply to the crowds, what's left that applies to the crowds? Nothing? Then you're back to where you started, that he's not talking to the crowds. You follow me so far?
I think so.
So I'm going to be quiet because I'm like, now I put my 5 minutes to the back end as opposed to the front end. But you get to go to the resource book and look at this. And then if there are a couple more guys who come next time, I know Tom is, we may need to rehash this, or you might need to rehash it for him so it's not me. Talk to me a moment, because we're down to our hour. We'll be ending in like 1 minute. Go around the room and tell me your thoughts, and it doesn't matter, like I didn't follow you, you lost me, because we can talk a little bit about this again next time. And then as a precursor to the Beatitudes, which might need like 1 or 2 sessions of their own. Vic, maybe we start with you. Any thoughts one way or the other, and we'll just go around the room real fast.
Well, a lot more thought about the Sermon on the Mount than I've ever given before. I have to start that. I do think, and when the scholars start dissecting words, I always have a problem with that, in all honesty. I do believe that the people were there, and I do believe Jesus was talking to the people and the disciples. And I do believe that he was training them in how to include people, how to get people to believe in what he was saying? How do you do it? So all of that makes sense to me. And I'm not hung up on whether there was a crowd there or not. I believe there's enough in the book that convinces me that crowd was there. And it was a very, very important part of Christ's mission to start this sermon. That's so for me. It was good, a good hour, and I got a lot out of it.
Thank you, Vic. Dave, any comments?
I was finding it interesting hearing about how diverse the crowds were that were there in attendance. And I don't know if I've been to any discussions where they talked about how widespread the crowds came from.
Cool. Bob?
No, I think, yeah, just, it's the message, the messenger, and the messaging. And I think when we start getting into the messaging, we have to look at who the crowd is and who the audience is. And that, yeah, I think Vic said it well too, is such a diverse crowd in a very poor area, but yet there were people from Jerusalem and Decapolis, which we know now what it is, and others. It also makes it interesting as to how do you speak to such a wide audience and have impact with all of them.
Yeah, very good. Mark, your thoughts? Or no, let's start. Yeah, Mark, you go first, and then we'll let Bert close it.
Yeah, well, I think it's, why did Jesus choose off the bat two fishermen, two brothers? Out of the numerous people that were following him at the time because he had done ministry. And I think even in that era, there were political implications for the people, as there is today. And this was a man who was offering perhaps something very different. I'm talking about Jesus as and his message was inspiring and hopeful, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm totally convinced that there were, the crowd was following Jesus and that they were perhaps pleased, or I would assume pleased that he chose two of them in the beginning to be his first disciples.
Yeah, it looks like there are two sets of brothers, so there's four.
Yeah.
But he only talks about the fishermen. He doesn't talk about anybody else. There might have been others, but there's a point he's trying to drive. Matthew's trying to drive home about how do you persuade and go fishing.
Mm-hmm.
Bert, how about you?
I thought it's fascinating, and it's like I told you, Chuck, the other day. It's there's this thing called micro hiking, and that's when you hike through a trail. And if I'm riding a mountain bike down a trail, the world's just going by me 100 miles an hour, and I'm trying to focus on the trail ahead of me and make sure I don't hit a rock. But if I'm going to hike that trail, get off the bike and walk the trail, I start soaking in the stuff around me. But even to a greater degree, I just read this in a magazine. Nancy and I were looking at it, and we've gotten into hiking now. And there's this thing called micro hiking, and that's when you stop and you only hike 100 yards maybe, but you take in like the leaves and the insects and everything around you, and you soak it up. And I feel like that's where I'm at with this. And I've read the Bible, I've read this multiple times, and now I'm starting to micro hike through this with you guys, and Chuck is doing and it's what's obvious today is this plane that I feel like, you know, we're on this one-dimensional plane that we live our life in, and I think about the people in that valley of death, that darkness, and they were living in this dimension that, you know, it's just a common dimension, but having this glimmer of hope that showed up on the mountain with this other dimension that is it really is fascinating. I think where we went tonight and what it opened my eyes to see in that part of the message. So that's my little piece of it.
So next time you can take the material that I sent with this in mind and start asking yourself as you work through this, how is Jesus teaching them how to persuade? What's the point of the Beatitudes? How are they organized? How do they remember this stuff? He's not handing out pieces of paper. It's too expensive. And that's in the material. So you get to cheat by reading my stuff, but you do your own stuff. And this is what we'll walk through it just like we did today by looking at the verses. And so that way, when we do a study or you lead a study, you can do it just with the verses, or you can go into as many levels deep in research as you want to see what other people are saying. Now, one thing about words, Vic, did you hear earlier that Bob said that he's going to give David Nelson $1,000 tonight? Did you hear that? He said he's going to give him he was going to give David $1,000. Bob's going to say, "Oh no, I said I'm not going to give you $1,000." Right? Did you say it, Bob? I'm going to ask you. Did you say you're going to give David $1,000?
No.
No. Okay. Now, next week I'm going to say I got Bob's words down. He said he was, and I'll quote him just now. He said yes. Now we go back to the recording, and you find out he didn't say yes. He said no. So words matter when it comes to what he's going to agree to give David. Right? So sometimes what these scholars are doing, they sound like they are asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? Sometimes it's totally irrelevant, but sometimes it's very relevant. Like whether or not David gets $1,000 or Bob loses $1,000. So those two people might be really interested in whether or not Bob said yes or no. And we just had a little discussion just on one word. So today, the point of this is when you read the very simple message and the very simple statements that Jesus is talking to the crowds, yet some scholars are going to start giving you all these reasons why the crowds weren't there. They cut and run. No crowds there, or they weren't paying attention. You get to read this and say, wait a second. Bob didn't say he was going to give David $1,000. He said no. And right here it says the crowds are there. And so what I'm trying to give you guys confidence in is when people want to say, Chuck said yes, when Bob said no, you can find out for yourself. And I'm trying to give you the confidence to do it.
Unless you're reading the New York Times.
Well, that too. We could bring in the New York Times and then the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal and whatever else. So, but this is the idea. Now, what's really important is this next, just on the Beatitudes, in that small section, now that you know it applies to the crowds. And when you read the Beatitudes section, you get to read the Salt and Light part 2. It's all part of it. You get to read that for next time and see what you can discover about how persuasion techniques were taught by Jesus, not too different from how the Greeks were taught how to be a good lawyer. Because when everybody's going to take Bob to court for not giving David $1,000, because David might sue him based on what I said, you might need to have a lawyer who could argue both sides of the case. And this is what we're going to learn more about next week. So I'm done on my end. I went 8 minutes.
Chuck,
I'll call you right back. Bye.
hello, Chuck.
Yes.
Did Chuck leave?
No, Chuck is here.
He's here.
Can you please send an email advising what we should read in your, book, your
Yes, I did that. The one you got from me for today
Okay.
actually covers both weeks.
Oh, okay.
I'm ahead of
Okay.
you by
Got
1
it.
week. So by next week, I'm going to give you the stuff for the following week,
All right.
but you
All right.
already have it.
Okay. Thank you.
And then we
Great.
could, and when we get together, if it's just us, we'll just continue. If it's someone else, we'll have to take a little time to summarize. And that's okay with me.
All right.
Well, thanks so much for doing it. And thanks, Bert, for attempting to lead it and record it. You did a great job, even with bandwidth difficulties.
Well, I'll be back in Severna Park this weekend, and I will not have this problem again. So look forward to that.
Well,
All right.
thank you so much.
Have
Any
her
other
now.
questions for me before I let you guys go? I know we went overtime.
We'll see you guys.
Very
on
good.
Sunday.
See you.
Oh, and by the way, next time when Bert's in Severna Park, he can wave at me and do, timeout sign. And meanwhile,
Yeah.
without that, you could just break in and interrupt. Chuck, we're overtime. Is Sergeant of Arms, and you just get to break in at any time, okay?
All right, I'll see you
Good
guys
night.
on.
Yeah, and next time we'll
morning.
even pray. We'll pray the Lord's Prayer next time.
Awesome.
Yes.
See you
Okay.
on Saturday.
All right.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Saturday. We'll do it
Yeah.
on Saturday. Okay.
Take
Bye.
care, guys.
Thanks.
Bye now.